Well, welcome everyone. I know it's the last session of the day, so I really appreciate your attendance. This session is presented by the AIFST, which is the Australian Institute of Food Science and Technology. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sandra Loader. I've had 30 years in the FMCG space and always in food. I now have a portfolio of boards, one of those being the AIFST, the Beverage Council, and also work with Hargraves Institute, which is about innovation and collaboration. So excited to be here. The topic today, food policy and regulation for an innovative Australian food industry. So the nature of Australia's food regulatory system that is reactive, largely application-driven and constrained by ad hoc policies is often bearing no relationship with each other. So despite this, it can deliver outcomes that support innovation. So today we will discuss the role of the food industry in defining success when it comes to food regulation. So I can't do that by myself, so I have some panellists with me today. But just before I introduce them, I just thought I'd let you know the flow of the day. We'll just have an introduction from the individuals, a presentation by Chris, a little bit more about learnings of Fiona's 25 years or 35 years in the industry, and then hear from Ashna, a winner of the AIFST Student New Product Development Award in 2019. Then we'll have time for questions and then a quick wrap up, and then, as you've heard, the SDG and all of the teams will be leading us out. So please stay tuned for the session in that forum. So I'd like to introduce our panellists. They will introduce themselves. So firstly, on my left here, Fiona. Over to you, Fiona.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Great to see some people in the room. So, as Sandra said, my name's Fiona Fleming. I've been working in the food industry for about 35 years. I'm a food scientist by training. And most recently, I guess my passion has been around food policy and regulation and how that enables industry to innovate.
Preston. I'm a food lawyer of, again, about 35 years' experience. There are such things as food lawyers. Yes, we're a dying breed. I think what makes me get up in the morning is thinking about the potential for the Australian food sector and thinking, how would it be if we got it right? You know, we are in the right place, we are at the right time. How would it be if we get it right? And that's a very exciting prospect for me.
Thank you for having me. I am Ashna Gobin. I have 10 years of experience as a qualified chef. And I've always been curious to know and understand the science behind why we make food and how food tastes good. So I decided to change a career, which is a bit risky at this age. And I am currently doing my third year at Deakin University, Food and Nutrition Science. So within that 2 years, I've won 2 competitions, a few other ones. So the latest one was the Macadamia Innovation Challenge and the Student Product Development Challenge this year through the AIFST with 4 teams that we developed a very innovative product. So I hope to tell you more about that.
So thank you, panel. That's great. Can I just ask the audience, who's working in the innovation space at the moment? Anyone? A couple of you. What about the regulatory or policy making space? Okay. Retail or government? Right. And then manufacturing or marketing and sales. Okay, so a bit of a mix. I mightn't have covered you all, but just to get a bit of an idea of the backgrounds that you're from, so thank you for that. So we might kick off with you, Chris. Do you want to just give us a bit of an overview on foods, needs and the pyramid and what that means in terms of regulation and innovation?
Thanks. Food need hierarchies. Who here has heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Who can tell me some of the things in Maslow's hierarchy? Shout them out. Yeah, food, clothes and shelter, down at the bottom. What's right at the top? Self-actualisation. Who wants to go on a course on self-actualisation? Well, actually, no. A lot of this talk is drawn from a paper that was published in 2007 in the Journal of Nutrition and Educational Behaviour. And that Satter, it's a Ms. Satter, came up with this great idea of turning Maslow's hierarchy of needs into a food-based idea. So it's a pyramid. What does a food-based pyramid look like? Well, down at the bottom is avoiding starvation. It's not too much of an issue in Australia, although it's not absent totally. I call that the porridge level. Can we eat at all? Well, if we've avoided starvation, we can go up a level and talk about nutrient security. This, if you will, is the carrots level. We are not just having food to eat, we are having food that provides the right levels of nutrition. Okie doke. Next, food safety. People have challenged me, why is food safety so high? The reality is if you're starving, you don't care about food safety, right? You need to eat, and you will eat just about anything, whether or not it's safe. Nutrient security is a little bit the same, right? If you're going to be dying of rickets, you're not too worried about where your sources of vitamins are coming from. So this is the mince level, right? We are eating food that is nutritionally sufficient for our needs. It's putting off starvation, and it means we can start worrying about microbiology. Food variety and novelty. We're getting quite high up the system and we're starting to feel like Australia here. This is where you have safe food, you have nutritious food, and you have plentiful food. Sounds like us, doesn't it? This is the chocolate level, right? The level where you can actually choose the foods in your diet. But believe it or not, there is a higher level than this. And I believe this is where we are in Australia. We're at ethics. What is the ethics level? This is where we choose to eat in order to define who we are. Our food choices make a statement as to the sort of person we are. This is the organic gluten-free tofu level. So far, so good. We have a hierarchy of needs that's built from top to bottom, just like Maslow. There are a couple of things that are important to note about this particular pyramid. Firstly, it is wealth-based. By and large, as you move up the pyramid, your society increases in wealth, both as GDP and as personal income. You need to be relatively wealthy, certainly in world terms, to be at the ethical level. To make those sort of choices, you need to have some disposable income. Here's the key thing. As you go up the pyramid, social cohesion decreases. What do we mean by social cohesion? The degree to which society agrees with you about what is important. Okay? You might think that food waste is important, and you would have a lot of people who agree with you. But is there broad consensus across society that that is the most important issue in food? Maybe not. Maybe there are other people who think other issues are important. The need for more balanced diets, the need for vegetarianism and so forth, organic food. At the top level of ethical choice, where you are making choices to express your individuality, you cannot expect that individuality to be shared. So as you move up the pyramid, social cohesion dies. Everyone agrees starving is a bad idea. Not everyone agrees that organic food is necessarily the most important issue facing the Australian food industry. There is, however, a regulatory pyramid here. There is a space that regulation can usefully serve a purpose in, and that is here, right? You cannot pass a law which says thou shalt not starve. Well, you can pass it, it just won't do any good. Likewise, when you start to get up into the ethical area, the danger of passing a law is that becomes a law for everyone when social cohesion is low. So you don't want one person's view of the world to dictate what is important for everyone. So there actually is a space where regulation should not go. Where do you think the social media pyramid sits? Ooh, there. Right? The social media is all about expressing who I am by what I eat. Right? There was a lovely cartoon I saw. It's a very concerned waiter asking the customer whether they enjoyed their food. And the customer says, it was fine. Why do you ask? You didn't take a photograph of it. Guess which of those two pyramids drives regulation? It's not the bottom one, it's the brown one. Social media and activism drives regulation because we have a political food regulatory system. So what does this show? Firstly, pressed too many buttons there. Political imperatives are not always good food policy because the area of overlap of the social media pyramid and the regulatory period is quite small. So if our regulation is being driven by the noise, it's going to deliver in the wrong areas. Second, this is a well-known psychological fact. People assume greater social cohesion with their own ideas than actually exists, right? Everyone in this room believes some things are important. And the tendency is you will tend to think that everyone agrees with you. The sad news is, my friends, they don't. They don't. What you think is important to you, but the extent to which it's shared by other people tends to be overestimated, just as a human condition. What it also shows, ethical matters, that top end of the pyramid, get dressed up as safety issues. They use the language of public health in order to get them across the table, because otherwise you have the social cohesion fight. If you dress it up as food safety, there is no fight. So, some interesting thoughts. The other thing which I think is a really interesting point for today is that there is a policy-based end to food standards. Exactly how far should food standards go? There are areas it should not transgress into. Excuse me. And I won't talk about country of origin labelling there at all. So, traffic light regulation. This is part of the way forward, and I just want to float some ideas, and when you talk to us back in question time about the sort of regulatory problems that you might be facing, think about it in these terms. What we have at the moment is essentially a red light system. What the law says, it prohibits everything, right? You want a food additive? Food additives are prohibited unless specifically allowed, right? You want to just put in a new processing aid? Prohibited unless specifically allowed. This is the system we have at the moment. We need to change this system. This is the key thing for innovation. So what do we do? We essentially are strangling innovation by this system. So we need a new model. What would that new model look like? Let's have a green light. Let's have some things that are just allowed. And the Food Standards Code can say these things are allowed. You don't need to go through any regulatory hoops. Well, regulators aren't renowned for their ability to let things go through to the keeper. So there's a second level. And how many did I press there? Allow by self-assessment. The regulators in this room are now sticking their fingers in their ears and going la 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 la, because the idea of industry self-assessing its regulatory compliance is a fraught issue indeed. But nonetheless, I want it there as a yellow light system. And finally, is essentially the current regime where we allow things, but only if the regulatory approval exists. Now, you might think it's funny that in the scope of a regulatory or an innovative conference, we should be talking about still prohibiting things and requiring them to be regulated. If time persists in the questions, I'll answer that, but I still insist that there will be times when you want the regulators to have their paw prints on your new innovative product. And we'll come to some of those ideas later. I don't want to take up too much time, so let's call that one quits at that. Thanks for the time, and let's get on to the Q&A.
Thanks, Chris. We might just hear from Fiona. Fiona's got 35 years experience and having spent a lot of her time in the food space, navigating the regulatory aspects as well as driving innovation. What challenges have you found, Fiona, in your years in that space?
Wow. So I've got a lot of war stories that I could tell. I guess the first thing I wanted to say is to support what Chris has been saying. I think that we have to say up front that the food industry and the regulators all agree that we want safe food. That goes without saying. I think the issue becomes, what do we call safe food? And then that brings in the element of risk. So the regulators will potentially take, as Chris has said, that whole of population assessment when they assess risk, whereas the food industry will want to do a more, different risk assessment. So that's where we don't always line up. I guess the issues I see is that really fundamentally the regulatory policy at the moment is it's not permitted unless it's specifically permitted. So it creates all sorts of issues, and we've seen, if you've been here over the last couple of days, a lot of small to medium enterprises who really want to be innovative, and a lot of them don't have the food backgrounds that potentially the panel does or the people in the room. So they don't even know where to start looking at food regulation, and then when they start to get in there, they don't understand how it works, which is great for people like me who do help food companies, but not good for the SMEs who actually don't even understand the food regulatory system. So in order to keep people safe, companies like this need to actually be able to access the regulatory system and understand it in a way that they can make sure their products are safe and are legal. So that would be the first thing. I think the other thing I've seen is that, and I made this comment to someone earlier, that Australia used to be the testing ground for a lot of international companies. They saw us as a really nice market, and they would bring products to Australia to test market them. And a lot of marketing managers' careers were made or not on the success of a product launch here, but it gave Australia a bit of an edge in terms of trialling new products and then having consumers having access to those. Unfortunately, over the years that I've been working in the food regulatory space, what I've seen is that process shut down because we've got products coming in, ingredients coming into Australia that just are not approved. They're approved everywhere else in, developed countries, but because of the way our code is written, they're not approved here. So we don't get the benefit of those new ingredients or new products so that we can innovate. And so you start to see the level of innovation going down, the appetite for it going down, because you have a conversation and it happens, to me a number of times where a company will ring up and say, look, we've got this product, we want to bring it into Australia to test market it. It's on the market everywhere else. And when I look at it, I say, you can't bring that product in, and it's going to take you 18 months, 2 years to get to a point where it's going to be legal, and they just walk away. So
doesn't allow us to remain competitive, does it, if that's the case, the length of time. So I think there's probably somewhere in between, particularly if we can get more harmonisation across, geographical boundaries, if the work's been done. And as we're advocating, safety is paramount when it comes to putting something in your mouth. I look at, the world's changing, and you look at drones. Regulation is catching up to, how to fly drones, where to fly them. We can't be as flexible as that because we're really talking about people's livelihoods here, and, anything that they consume, it's paramount that we understand that. So, Ashna, you mightn't have your 35 years experience like Fiona, and how's things been for you starting out and just getting, into that food space, and how have you been able to navigate the innovation and the regulatory? You won an award, so tell us a little bit about that and then how you were able to navigate that in the new innovative space.
Yes, thank you for that question. So I'll tell you a little bit background of what we have innovated. So the project team for this year for the SPDC, the Student Product Development for the AIFST, was to use food waste. So we looked at what was the highest waste into the agricultural level. So we found that approximately about 60% of the cauliflower leaves, the whole cauliflower plus the leaves, get wasted and get ground. So we tried to find into that square. So we wanted to create and innovate something within that square, because normally when we look at creation, sometimes people are trying to go too far. We wanted to stay into the square and said, how can we make something with what we've got here? So we found the leaves, and we used the technology, and then we made it into a powder and used the powder to add it into a flatbread mix, because that was like staple food for the consumer and market research that we found. So once we've got our final product, as a student, we have done food policy and regulation at Deakin University, which was amazing because this is part of our curriculum and the unit that we've done. But as a student, to understand it and to navigate through, first to understand the category was a little bit hard for us to understand it. The second was the language, because understanding the language that they have, it's not the same that you're talking to me, it's not the same. And to navigate through that system was a little bit difficult, so we had to go elsewhere and find support. So what we did, we tried to ask the university to help us, which was amazing, they did that. But we also found from the food industry, through connections question that, is this a way, how can we understand, and that had helped us develop the product, with the right packaging and with the right claim that we wanted. So we actually had a claim about ions and the fibre content. So to understand through the categories, we had to go through that.
And based on your innovation, did you have to pull back to sort of fit in with the code? Did it stifle any of the, new things that you wanted to do when you were developing the product?
So we wanted to do more thing with it, of course, because the powder itself, we didn't know if it was regulatory or if we could use it in other things. But if we could understand more, or we could have the ability to do it, we could have created better and more innovation. So within that innovation space, it's great that Australia or SME is trying to innovate, because we need those innovations to happen.
Yeah.
But at the same spot, are we able to navigate? Are we able to understand? This is where I find it's a little bit of worry.
Yeah. And if there was one thing that you think, might benefit innovation going forward in that link and the intersection of regulatory and policy, what would be the one thing from your perspective, being sort of newer in this field? What do you think that might be?
I think, from my perspective, that's just my opinion, I think we just need a little bit more collaboration in regards to governments and academic and industry to work all together to find a solution. The prime thing that we want to understand is, well, yes, we are having safe food. That's the main thing. But the other thing is, are we able to innovate in that space as for food is safe? So working together collaboratively, I think that's a key. If it's already been done somewhere apart in the other world, like European countries and America, why can't we have it here? Why are we behind? This is a question that I always ask, why are we not there yet?
Yeah, thanks for that, Ashna. That's great. Chris, I might flick to you now. You as a lawyer and in that legal profession, they have a way of twisting things and making everything work. Based on what you've presented, what are you doing differently in order to try and bridge that gap to solve the problem that we have, that we don't want to be stifled in innovation, we want regulation to catch up or, work together? What are you doing in, a day-to-day basis to make that more seamless?
Thanks. It's difficult, of course, because as a lawyer, you're sort of constrained to work and advocate for the clients you have. But fortunately, I also have a little bit of spare time for doing some policy work and some submissions through to Food Standards New Zealand. And I did bring up the traffic light system. So one area that is currently under review is novel foods. How good would it be if, rather than having all novel foods prohibited, and remember the definition of novel foods is quite inwardly focused, a food that does not have a history of consumption in Australia or New Zealand, doesn't matter if it's elsewhere in the world. How nice would it be that if a novel food is approved in another major developed country, you can pick the list. I'd have EU, the UK, as they're not going to be EU for very much longer, Japan, maybe, certainly the US, Canada. The list doesn't have to be that big. But if the food is approved in any of those countries, it gets the green light and is automatically approved for Australia. Wouldn't that be nice? Think of your food additives. If they are approved in any of those jurisdictions, they automatically get the green light and don't need to be approved again in Australia. Processing aids, GMOs, all of these things where there are regulatory barriers to innovation, wouldn't it be nice if an overseas approval automatically gave you a green light? Okay, but what happens if it's not approved in those countries? This is where the red light system works to your favour. If you have a product and it's not approved in any major overseas organisation, to sell it, you want the Australian government's paw prints all over your product. That will help the domestic market, and it will be almost essential for your export markets internationally. So here is an example where you actually don't need to get into that regulatory tricky area of self-assessment. You could have, for novel foods, for additives, for processing aids, for GMOs, for a whole range of products, a green light for things that are approved internationally, and a regulatory system for approvals for everything else. If we took that regulatory workload out of FSANZ, of reapproving, reinventing the wheel all the time, they would have the time to spend on the Australian innovation. And I think, excuse me, there are some tragedy stories of Australian innovation. I mean, I think that the point that you made is quite good, Ashna, that we aren't so good at taking research and development and innovation that happens in our academic world and bringing that into industry. And part of the problem is regulation. So CSIRO developed a great thing. It's called the Arctic apple. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's an apple, when you slice it, it does not go brown. Right? Can you market this in Australia? No. So they market it in the US. You want to have an Arctic apple? Go to the US. CSIRO developed a gluten-free barley that was made into a beer. So there is actually a gluten-free beer. Where can you buy this? Germany. Can you buy it in Australia? This is the problem that regulation happens. We have great innovation in our food sectors. We can't bring it to the market because regulation gets in the way. So I think part of my work is advocacy around those barriers, so that when the next Arctic apple, the next gluten-free, the next cauliflower powder comes along, we can take it to market rather than have these regulatory problems get in the way.
Yeah. So it all sounds easy. We just click our fingers and that happens. But as we know, when it comes to regulation, it's a robust system that the regulators go through and policy. And I think it's important to realise that. And I think more collaboration, I think, is what I'm hearing, is going to start to bring the people to the table earlier, so we start to see some of the new things that are being worked on. And with IP and that, there's much more in that open innovation space where people are sharing ideas, and SMEs aren't necessarily solving the problems that we have or coming up with the innovative solutions. And I think the more collaboration we have with those groups, the better off we're going to be in able to accelerate what's going to be a more fit-for-purpose solution to encourage and keep innovation here in our own country. So, we all want to make money out of exports if we can. So I think that's the answer at the end of the day, as opposed to, how do we collaborate together? And that's really what we need to find, I think, a path through. So Fiona, from your perspective, you're leading the AIFST, which is an organisation around food science and technology. So you have access to, I guess, the members that are all in different sectors of the food and regulatory landscape. What steps do you think the AIFST can take to bring regulation and innovation together a bit more to help, be part of the solution as opposed to, the issues that we have?
Well, so I think AIFST is made up of our individual members who work broadly across the food industry, and I think, to pick up on the point that we've all made, is collaboration is really important. So making sure that whatever sphere our members are working in, that they actually have the opportunity to collaborate. And so, we can organise education, seminars and workshops. We can organise events where people can network. And I think, one of the key pieces of feedback I've had since taking on the role with AIFST is really the importance of providing networking opportunities. We are seeing a lot of our technical and research and development functions going offshore. So we have a smaller community of food science and technologists here. We've got people working in universities, working very hard on innovation, but we don't have enough forums like this, or like what AIFST can offer, where people can come together and just talk about things. I was talking to a colleague earlier today, and he said, the benefit that he gets out of events like this is that he meets people that he would not otherwise come across, or he reacquaints himself. So I think one of the roles of AIFST is to provide the opportunity for networking and make sure that we have a broad range of stakeholders that come to those events. I think the other thing is just keeping members up to date with what's going on. So if there are new innovations and policies and discussions going on in other countries, we have access to that information through our sister organisations like the IFT in the US, like the organisation in the UK, and in New Zealand as well. So we keep very close with those. So I think that's a role that we can fulfil.
Sounds like a plan. That collaboration just keeps coming up, doesn't it, as a way to move forward. I know I'm sitting on the Beverages Council. One of the things that the technical committee does in reference to policy and also regulation is have an annual meeting with FSANZ in order to discuss what they see as up and coming challenges, some of the new ingredients that are coming out, and they look at ways to engage early in order to try and get the regulatory bodies thinking about that and starting to tap into it, because it's like anything. Innovation is so broad, unless you can narrow it down, it's what are you really going after and what are you seeking information on. So I think the more that you can make appointments to work with these people, they are up for the challenge in terms of trying to understand where you're heading, and therefore that gives us an opportunity, I think, to navigate the ambiguity of, things that are going to be new and different. So I think in terms of the current food regulation system, what about we've talked a little bit about the export market and how that becomes more challenging. Is there any other solutions to, a lot of people are interested in how do you drive export better and navigate that? When navigating the regulatory landscape overseas, that becomes another challenge in itself. So maybe you've got some thoughts on that, Chris, in terms of, what's the best approach when you're looking to export? How do you navigate that landscape?
Sure. The short answer is to get in touch with some really competent people in the country to which you are exporting. The reality is that we live in a world increasingly characterised by non-tariff trade barriers, and to get across those and then understand in country which are considered important and which are not is the key to success of your exporter. So find your local partner, I think, is the best thing. The difficulty is, and I've been in this position where clients have come and said, I want to export my product to Thailand, can you check it against Thai labelling laws? And to a degree I can. I'm looking at an English translation of the Thai labelling requirements. But it's not the same. It's just not the same as getting someone from Thailand to say, well, actually, to do this, you actually have to do it this way, not that way, or something like that. So there are certainly good partnerships are important for the export. But then there is the bureaucracy. So to give them their credit, the Department of Agriculture has done a major exercise of rewriting how food exports are governed, and we have hopes, again, that it tends to be a fairly broad brush umbrella legislation. We're yet to see exactly how the devil in the detail is going to work out. But at least they've got some right approaches. They're looking at risk-based approaches. So I think we tend to knock governments very easily and knock bureaucracies and see them as burdens. The reality is that there are agencies that are trying to do the right thing. They just are struggling with lack of resources or struggling with lack of information. So the message, I think, for everyone who's interested in export is to actually go and talk to the Department of Agriculture who manages food exports, right? And just get a sense of what's driving them, what are their policy concerns, what's the issues, what problems is my export going to cause for them? Because if you can take their problems away from them, it'll be a much smoother road, at least to get it out of the country. Getting it into the country of destination could be another issue, as every exporter will have found. A further difficulty, Australia does itself no favours in the international market. When you look at non-tariff trade barriers, we can point the finger at overseas countries, but the reality is we are amongst the worst offenders. We have a quite iconoclastic food standards code. There is no country in the world that has a food labelling system that's equivalent to ours. So there's no one label going to cover Australia and somewhere else. You export to Australia, you're going to need an Australia-specific label. Likewise, be prepared for when you export for the same to apply. We can't hold ourselves up as any example, unfortunately.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Chris. I think certainly with the changing times, we know business models are changing. The expectation on innovation is getting faster and faster. And I think, and Fiona alluded to it, it's not always the food scientists that are the people leading the forefront of the new businesses that are evolving. And those businesses are evolving exponentially as opposed to when I grew up, quite linear. And same with the processes that sit behind innovation, they were quite linear. I think we need to recognise that, things are changing at an exponential rate, and those that succeed are certainly in that space. So,
can I add a real example of that? And when you look at the disruption to the whole export bureaucracy and import bureaucracy, particularly for China, is look what the gaijos are doing. Right, the people who come to Australia take the product off the shelves essentially, right, send it to China in small individual packets, right, and they're just bypassing the Australian export rules, they're bypassing the Chinese import rules, and they're making a killing on it by essentially saying, we're not going to play your game. Now, I don't think that's necessarily good economic policy, right, but it shows the disruption. You know, if the governments aren't careful, all they do is drive people to these disruptive models rather than get buy-in to the regulatory model.
Yeah, so we don't want to be playing catch-up. You know, I think it's about working together, and I think, as Fiona said, someone said, move fast and break things. So it is about breaking the model and thinking about, you know, different things. So thank you for your insights. I think we've got plenty of time for some questions from the floor, so I might hand over to Will, who's got the roving mic there, for any questions, or people that might want to make a comment on something that's been said. You know, if you're from that policy and regulatory space, you might want to share what you're doing in that space that's going to help, and what we need to be considering as well. So I'll open to the floor. Thanks for any questions.
Thanks, Sandra. Any questions from the ground? Here we are.
Hello, I'm Shreya. Just wondering about the farmer suicides. So what has been the government doing to reduce the farmer suicides in Australia?
Who would like? Chris? Thank you. Oh.
Why is everyone looking at me?
Well, you went for the microphone.
You want a lawyer to talk about mental health?
Well, briefly, only briefly, Chris.
In one level, you have to ask the governments, but it is a huge social issue. And the focus, quite rightly, is on the farmers. But in fact, the issue of mental health is much broader spread throughout the food chain. I think that, you know, the governments have programs of throwing money, but the reality for mental health, particularly in regional and rural Australia, is to get the professionals and the help out there. When you've got to, I have a personal example of a relative of mine has to drive an hour and a half to access a psychologist to deal with a trauma event that's happened in her life. That's too far, right? When you've got to drive there once a week, right, that's a big commitment of time. So until you get the resources to do it, it's going to continue to be a problem. But I just want to touch on the fact that one of the characteristics of the Australian workplace at the moment in low wage growth is we're getting quite a degree of job insecurity. And that is, I think, a huge mental health challenge for our industry as to how we engage the people who make our food throughout the supply chain, starting with the farmers, but also more broadly through industry, because I think there are mental health challenges there, absolutely.
Thank you, Chris. There is a question here that I have on the app, and it's around cell-based meats. What's the fastest regulatory pathway to navigate for cell-based meats without having to go through the novel foods category?
Good question. Whoever raised that one.
Whoever raised that, just chase me down. My rates are reasonably competitive for the food industry, and I'd be more than happy to advise you. No, seriously. In some ways, regulation in this area is slow. So be it insect-based proteins, cell-based meats, whatever, there is a regulatory lag, and how does one say this politely? If the regulators are lagging, that's not your fault. And if there are, you know, doors you can drive through at the moment that might be closed, think about how you drive through them. That's probably the best hint I can give. Lawyers can't encourage people to break the law, let me say, so I'm not encouraging anything like that. But there are opportunities in the grey areas of the language of novel foods, and possibly now is a good time to explore how those might be exploited.
Thanks, Chris. Fiona, you had something to say?
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Chris said. I think that there is a good case for, I think a lot of the food industry and are scared of talking to the regulators. And I think, you know, talking about collaboration, I think it's important to collaborate with the regulators as well. A lot of them have not worked in the food industry or have limited experience in the food industry, and, you know, without sounding rude, they don't necessarily understand how food gets made and all the intricacies and all the work that goes into it. So I think there's a definite case for sitting down, identifying who the regulators are that you need to talk to, and just having an open, honest conversation about, here's my product, we've done all the work, it's safe, we want to get it to market in the shortest way we can. But also hand on heart saying, obviously, if we produce a food that's unsafe, it's not good for our business, so we wouldn't do that. And I think, there's a real element, we haven't talked about it today, the T word of trust. I used to get up when I talked about food regulation and say, I'm from the food industry, don't hate me, because you sit in front of a room of consumers or regulators and, certainly there are elements of the industry, like any industry, that don't do the right thing, but I firmly believe that the majority of food manufacturers do the right thing. And so there's a real case for building trust, and I think that's going to be part of moving forward with the regulatory system, is saying that there has to be a level of trust between the regulators and the manufacturers to talk about risks and how they're managed.
And can I just add to that too, Will? I think when you look at the people who are developing or pursuing these, quite often there's been a lot of research that's gone into creating the new and the different. Places like CSIRO as well have very good connections with the regulatory bodies in order to start to, scope what the up-and-coming novel type foods are, and therefore start to get ahead of the curve. So I think the more you can engage, even if you think you've got something really special and unique, the more you can engage with people who are well versed in being able to navigate through that system and to deal with the regulators, there'll be a faster cut through in order to get better answers or ask the right questions in order to get the right answer. Because if you're not asking the right question of the regulator, you might get a blanket yes, no, or not possible. So it's about really exploring those options, and there are people skilled in doing that.
Great. Ashna, you had something?
Yes, I'm going to add something on top of that. When we're saying about regulatory and when we're making novel food, we're so happy about making it, but then we forget that we can ask questions. We can go to the regulatory offices. They are so happy to help. In case they were so happy to help me because I asked the question, that means I care. It shows that you're willing to do something better. It not only helped them, but it helped the whole industry, helped the whole governance. It helped everyone to make it better, because then you can find a solution together. I think working, like I said, working collaboratively, don't be scared to ask any questions. They're there to help you out, and we can always make it together.
Good point.
Great. Any questions from the floor? I've got a question. So one of the things around policy and regulation is that you often find that, at least you hear from the startup community or the innovation community, and they always say, one of our biggest things we have to navigate and the cost of setting up a company is regulation. And that's fine, that's great, because it's there for a public good. But how do we create an environment where startups that are looking at the forefront of innovation, technology, whether it be insect-based foods, whether it be cell-based, plant-based, any innovation across the whole food value chain, even food loss, food waste. How do we make it easier for, how do we make it easier for these, I suppose, visionaries that are looking at ways in which we disrupt our food system, help inform regulation, help inform what's coming up, and be prepared for that, and I suppose from a government perspective, what sort of education needs to happen about that side to kind of bring that equilibrium so that we actually get commercialisation of great technology. We are moving fast. We are, at the forefront. Yeah.
I think, Will, that's a great question, but it's also a complicated question, because when you talk to a regulator or anyone in policy, they will go back to the scientific approach, which is tell me exactly what you want and then I'll tell you what we can do. So I think in terms of bridging that gap, that becomes one of the key challenges. I think it's at what point do you then engage, because you need to have almost a semi-refined idea in order to be able to understand and be able to fast-track aspects of that. I don't know whether, Fiona, you've had you've had some key projects that have been really challenging that I know you can't talk about, but in terms of the type of approach when it's something new and completely different, how have you sort of gone about that?
I think it's a great question, and really it was the heart of what we're getting at today, I guess, is the fact that we don't want to stifle innovation. There's all these great things out there happening. I think what I would pick up on again is the collaboration. So, the regulators will say, look, I can't help you because you've got to, as Sandra said, tell me what you want. But I think we have to challenge that. We have to go to them and say, this is new, it's innovative, the regulation system doesn't allow us to do it, or we don't know how to navigate it. You need to help us. And doing that not just through the actual regulatory agencies, but talking to your state and federal representatives either in their portfolios. I mean, we had Katie Allen here today. I mean, Katie has done a massive job. She's a paediatric allergist, but she has worked tirelessly with the industry to help industry understand food allergy better and for the medical community to understand what the industry is doing. So I think that's a fantastic example of the work that we can do if we collaborate. So, you guys are out there innovating. Who are you talking to? Start to take opportunities like this to engage with the people who make policy and regulation.
I'd like to just put a little social cohesion challenge out here. Who here believes innovation is a good thing? See, look around, you're in a like-minded conference, right? What do you reckon would happen if we asked that question out in the rest of society, right? I'm not sure that everyone would be putting their hand up. You've got to understand that for the vast majority of Australians, there are 3 key things that rule their response to newness, and that is fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? If you want your innovative product to cut through, you must develop the social cohesion to remove fear, uncertainty, and doubt first and foremost, because then regulators will be with you.
Great, thanks, Chris. And any other thought bubbles coming out of the ground? Any insights to share? Great, thank you.
Thank you, panel. As compared to the US or the European countries, like the US has FAO and USDA and massive databases to show the people and the scientists what to do and what not to do. It's very easier to find the regulations around food and nutritional data in that kind of countries. Do you feel that we are a bit behind in that space here in Australia? And is there anything that can be done to somehow facilitate it?
I think I would say definitely we are a little bit behind because innovation is not driving as fast as we wanted. But I had a good chat with Chris before, and I think he's the best one to tell you what's going to happen in the space. That's the same question I asked him before. So he's going to be happy to re-evaluate that again.
Wow, hospital pass. Look, I wish I could say it would get better soon. The reality is that food standards are regularly reviewed. We had one in 2015. Probably the next one's due about 2029. That'll be after my retirement date, but it'll be in the peak of your career. So I think the message is, if you are unhappy about the language, if you're unhappy about the access, start doing something about it yourselves. Let the regulators know that you can't find the novel food standard or something, or you can't understand it once you've found it. At one level, it would be nice if our laws were in plain English. On the other hand, we deal in a technical space. So let's try and find that balance to make the laws and legislation accessible and easy. I agree. I reckon it's a great project.
I think one of the key messages we have to get across is that the food industry is becoming more global. So, while we have a vibrant food industry here in Australia and we have a good export-import, I think that we are more and more relying on overseas countries to provide us with the technology, the ingredients, the know-how and the science. And that's certainly a message when I talk to the regulators, that I try and make them understand that in a lot of cases we have no say. There are a lot of ingredients that we just don't make here, we can't source. So I think one of the key messages really is the fact that we need to recognise we play in a global market and we're the tail on the dog, and we can't wag the dog. So
we're about 1.5% global market.
Great. I have another question, unless I'm taking one from somewhere else.
The clock's run out.
Okay, we've got one more question because I think I just want to ask the question. My question is around in the food innovation space, whether it's around track and trace and technologies, there's heaps around kind of counterfeit, food safety, food recall, which costs businesses billions of dollars globally. How are regulators working with some of these emerging technologies, whether it be blockchain, whether it be covert technologies, overt technologies, DNA trace sampling, fingerprinting technologies? How are regulators working with that? Is there a really good model around this that you've seen somewhere in the world?
No.
That's very encouraging. No, great. Well,
Don't be alarmed, Will. I think
not alarmed.
No, the more people that we have raising what I see as these, new business models, evolving innovation. You have to challenge the business model that you have, and don't think that you're not going to be disrupted. And whether that's the policy makers, regulators, those that have traditionally been in the innovation space or supply chain space, we're seeing it everywhere. And that whole model means that if you can look at how you disrupt yourself, then you start to unlock some of the questions that you need to ask to be successful in the future. And based on the speed of change, which is exponential, we will be left behind and we will be the dinosaurs if we don't adapt. And so whilst there's not an absolute quick solution, there are people that are working in this space and have been. We're not seeing it yet. I'm not saying in the regulatory space, but where there's changing business models. But the only advice I can give is try and disrupt yourself in this space to say, is my business model sustainable and relevant for the future based on organisations changing at the rate of change they are? Because if you do that, then you're going to start to unlock what is going to be required to be successful going forward.
And I'd like to add to my flippant answer if I can.
Yeah.
Where regulators are coming from is they don't care the means, they want the outcome. The outcome is paddock to place traceability, right? If you get served a steak in a restaurant, they want to know the name of the cow and what paddock it was done on. How you do that, right? They don't care. They want the evidence that you can do it. And this is to take the point that you were making, is that, as Sandra said, the tools are out there, the tools are developing all the time, but we need to be conscious of the outcome. And I think there is a little bit of a head in the sand in some elements of industry that we are not being aware that this is the tidal wave that's coming down on us. We need to know the name of the cow.
Great. I think that's the call right there that's waiting for us. And thank you very much for the panel. Just a big round of applause for Sharon and the panel.